Okay, I'm in Matthew 5 right now, and from verse 21 to the end of that chapter, there are 5 instances in which Jesus contrasts the law with his superior approach to the law. And these are those 5 famous examples where it starts out, you've heard that it was said, and then followed by, but I say to you. So there are 5 instances of this in Matthew 5. The first concerns murder. The second, adultery. The third, divorce. The fifth, the lex talionis principle, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And then the fifth is, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you. Now, I'm not going to go into each and every one of these. In fact, I'm just going to really do a case study of one of them, the last and final one in chapter 5, having to do with loving one's neighbor and hating one's enemy. Christians like to argue that there is no sense in these texts in which Jesus actually opposes himself to any aspect of the law as given by Yahweh. And that he's actually doing something else. So, for example, they'll argue, let's take the example of adultery, where Jesus says, it was said long ago, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you look upon another woman to lust after her, you have committed adultery already in your heart. They would say, Jesus is not opposing himself there to any aspect of Yahweh's law. He's simply upping the ante, for the covenant of grace, because we've been given such an abundance of grace by the Holy Spirit. Our mode of behavior under the new covenant must conform to a higher standard of righteousness than that which was given explicitly by Yahweh under the law. I would submit there's more going on here than that. So I would actually say that in that instant, Jesus is saying Yahweh is implying that Yahweh was wrong for merely prohibiting adultery on a physical level, and that he should have prohibited it on this other level. And although we can't establish that fact from that example, we can establish that from the fifth and final example about loving one's neighbor and hating one's enemy. So, he says here, starting in verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, etc., etc. Again, another typical approach that Christians make to this is to say that Jesus is addressing certain errors in understanding concerning the law, or addressed certain errors in application of the law that had grown up over time and become popular, and then became common expressions. And they'll say that because, for example, looking at what we just read, he says, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, this would seem to confirm the Christian argument, because there is no explicit statement made by Yahweh in the law that you should hate your enemy. So therefore, the idea that we should hate our enemy was a popular misconception that had grown up over time among certain Jews, perhaps. That seems plausible, but it's ultimately wrong. Because while you may not read the words in the Old Testament, specifically in the Pentateuch and the Law and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, you may not explicitly read, you shall hate your enemies. But it might as well say, hate your enemy, hate your enemies. When you add up everything, when you add up every attitude and action commanded by Yahweh of the Jews towards their enemies and towards foreigners, so whether that enemy is a political enemy, many of the Jews' enemies were considered enemies even when they had not explicitly opposed themselves to the Jews. Yahweh considered them enemies and told the Jews to consider them enemies, simply because they happened to occupy an area which Yahweh decided he wanted for the Jews. He wanted the Jews to acquire and inherit. But there are also texts about just with different standards of behavior for the native-born Jew, the resident alien who resided among the camp of the Jews, and then the foreigner. The foreigners were treated with great disrespect, and there are literally dozens of examples that we could find in the law, and I may do something on that as part of this series. I may actually go through many of them and just rattle them off quickly, citing maybe most of them, but going into some detail on others that are actually quite sadistic, but in many cases just unjust, very unjust, and just cruel. So that the Torah does more or less teach hate your enemy. And it certainly doesn't say to love your enemy. When I researched that, I could not find a single teaching in the Torah in which Yahweh tells the Jews to, or commands the Jews to love their enemies. Now, here's an interesting thing. When I Googled that, where does the Torah teach that we should love our enemies? The answer I got back was, nowhere in the Torah does it say in so many words to love your enemy. But then it goes on to try to establish that the principle was taught. And it cites two texts which don't at all support the point they want to make, but in fact supports the opposite idea. And that is Leviticus 19:17 to 18 and Exodus 23, 4 through 5. To summarize this as briefly as possible, Leviticus 19:18 is where you get the second of the two great commandments, to love thy neighbor as thyself. And when you read it in context, and you can go back to verse 9, I would read verse 9 through verse 18. Yahweh is commanding the Jews not to love the foreigner or to love their enemies, but rather to love their fellow countrymen. And that's exactly what it says. Here's Leviticus 19. Let's start with 18. I'm sorry, let's start with 17. You shall not hate your brother in your mind. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So your neighbor belongs to the children of your people. You shall keep my law. You shall not let... Okay, no, we don't need to go that far. So your neighbor is a member of the children of your people, the children of Israel. But this is consistent throughout this whole section. You shall not, verse 13, you shall not steal nor deal falsely nor lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name unjustly, nor shall you defile the name of your God. I am the Lord your God. You shall not treat your neighbor unjustly, nor rob him. Sorry, I had started at 12. Now I'm on 13. You shall not treat your neighbor unjustly, nor rob him. Okay, so who's your neighbor? The wages of him who is hired shall not remain with you all night until morning. You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor admire the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. There's your neighbor again. So who is your neighbor? Verse 16. You shall not go about deceitfully among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord your God. So you see, this is all rooted in loving your brother, and loving your neighbor is all rooted in loving those who belong to the community of your people. Okay, and then it goes on. You shall not hate your brother. We just quoted that. Verse 17. You shall not hate your brother in your mind. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor, not bear guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So far from suggesting that we should love our enemies, meaning non-Jews or those or foreigners, that principle applies to those perhaps with whom you may have a problem, but they are your fellow Jew, your fellow countrymen. And then Exodus 23, 4-5, I believe it was the other text that was brought up to make the claim that the idea of loving your enemy does exist in the Torah. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see your enemy's donkey fallen beneath its load, you shall not walk away from it, but shall surely help him with it. You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. Of your poor. See, if you keep going to verse 6 and you don't stop at 5, you shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. Down here in verse 9, you shall not oppress a resident alien. I challenge you, because I've already done it. I've already done it, and it's not there, but I would challenge you to look. Go through the Torah with a fine-tooth comb. Look deeply. Study the Torah deeply, and find me a single place where the broader context of loving your enemy does not have to do with a countryman who has wronged you. So my contention then is very simple, and that is that the law teaches the Jew to love the Jew and the resident alien, to the extent that the resident alien is sympathetic to the way of the Jews and sympathetic to the worship of Yahweh. Why else would the resident alien be a resident alien? Why else would he live there? Okay, that's it for this one. Let me just close with this. I skipped Matthew 5:17 through 18, I believe it is, where Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And he goes on to say that not one jot or tittle of the law shall pass away until heaven and earth pass away. I'm not going to go into any depth on that now, because I want to save that for when we cover Revelation 5 and the contract for humanity. Again, to use the phraseology of Israel Anderson, which I highly recommend you listen to his talks on YouTube, because he gets into a lot of what we're covering here too. I'm trying to get a little deeper and really look at every single instance where we can find a clear distinction being made between Jesus Father and Yahweh. But and I'm also wanting to get into some deeper esoteric stuff as well, related to the same theme. But I do want to just say, some people listening to this may be wondering, yeah, why did you skip those verses? Because don't those verses, don't they establish the opposite of what you're trying to say. In other words, Jesus seems to be saying that by saying that not a single jot or tittle of the law shall pass away until heaven and earth pass away, he seems to be endorsing the entire law. All I'm going to say about that is that in light of Yahweh being the devil, it changes our whole understanding of what it means or what it meant for Jesus to have fulfilled the law. And it changes somewhat, it changes quite a bit, his purpose for having fulfilled the law. So we can't assume the mainstream Christian interpretation of that text anymore. So I would simply submit that Jesus, in fact, does oppose aspects of the law in this section of Matthew 5 where he says, you know, it has been said, but I say unto you. All right? So let's move on from here. I didn't actually intend for this one to be quite as long as it ended up being. But let's keep plowing forward.